welcome. Can you kindly confirm you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As I said, my name is Silvia Jada. I work at the United Nations Environment Programme, the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. Welcome to these sessions of the annual forum of the Global Connector of Thailand on the next steps for business contribution toward climate action and nature protection. And thank you to the GCNT, for inviting me to moderate the session. I would like also to already thank the speakers who have already joined the session. Mr. Dominic Thompson, Deputy Director of the Environmental Justice Foundation, and Mr. Jens Raczynski, Regional Lead at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We had 45 minutes for this session. I understand also we are a bit late, so we may finish a bit earlier or keep it a bit shorter. Nevertheless, I would like to just give a brief introduction with no intention to summarize the very rich intervention and all the discussion that we have heard at the different sessions of the forum, but just highlight very few basic points. We know the world is facing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And we heard this at the intervention of the Prime Minister of Thailand this morning, the Minister of Natural Resources and Environment of Thailand, also in his intervention this morning, as well as from the UN Resident Coordinator for Thailand. These three elements of the planetary crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, are interlinked. To tackle climate change, we need to tackle loss of biodiversity and vice versa. And pollution exacerbates both climate change and loss of biodiversity in a direct or indirect way. And these three elements of the triple planetary crisis are interlinked because they share the same root cause or the same origin, which is unsustainable consumption and production. And when we look at the private sector, obviously the private sector has a lot to do with both consumption and production, but and with steering consumption and production towards sustainable consumption and production. And so have the governments, national governments, local governments, as well as local communities, and us as individual and society. And we had heard this message, I think, clearly from the intervention of Minister Baraputsi Barcha in the morning, that everybody's contribution and involvement is needed and indeed will be called upon to work toward Thailand's emission reduction target, including through the protection of ecosystems. So in many ways, and from what I have heard from other speakers as well, what emerged as a clear message, just it is even more needed now to join forces across different sectors of societies if we need indeed to find better ways to work consistently through different sectors of society together. But today we're speaking about what the private sector can do. And if in the other session we have heard about from the GCNT members themselves about what they're doing and their plans about climate change and protection of biodiversity, now we look at what private sector can do, but from a different perspective, which is the perspective of the organization represented by the speakers in this session. Please, if you have any questions, write them in the chat. And without further ado, I would like to kindly ask the speakers to briefly introduce themselves and their organization just in a few minutes. And after that, we move to the more substantive questions. I will give the floor now to Dominic, please.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for that introduction. And thank you also to the GCNT Forum for inviting me to speak today. So yes, my name is Dominic Thompson. I'm the Deputy Director and Project Manager for the Environmental Justice Foundation based in Bangkok. So the Environmental Justice Foundation, we are an international organization with our headquarters in London, but then satellite offices around the world. So we work a lot on environmental issues, as our name suggests, and focusing on ocean issues So looking primarily at fisheries issues here in Southeast Asia, especially here in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines. We also have offices in East Asia as well, so South Korea and also Taiwan, looking at similar issues of fisheries, illegal fishing, overfishing, destructive fishing practices, and also associated human rights abuses as well. More recently, the organization has started a new branch of campaigning, which is looking at plastics and especially looking at marine litter and the threats that ghost gears and abandoned fishing gears pose both to marine life, biodiversity, but also to coastal communities. And so back in 2020, we launched the new Net Free Seas project, which aims to work directly with communities, vulnerable communities that are affected both by sea level rises, climate change, and also the economic hardships that COVID presented, and connect them directly with recyclers who can process these nets, recycle them, and turn them into new products. So it's trying to both eliminate an environmental hazard, but also provide these communities with economic and financial benefits. So that's a new area that we've started branching out into. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more about how those kinds of examples, those case studies can emulate business experiences as well, and how businesses can get involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And now I pass the floor to Jens for also do the same. Please, Jens, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And thank you very much for GCNT to invite me to this forum. I am trying to start slides because I had prepared some slides, and I'm very curious to hear if you can see them. Yes. If you can put them in presentation mode, we can see them full screen. Is that it? I cannot see it. So, okay, yes. Good. Yeah, thank you again. So just a very quick introduction of my organization. First of all, my name is Jens Raczynski. I'm regional lead of the UNFCCC IGES Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific. So we are one of 6 regional collaboration center established by the UNFCCC within the last couple of years. So while our headquarters is based in Bonn, as you probably most of you know, there's a few of us sitting in these regional offices, very few of us. I'm the lucky representative here in Asia Pacific in Bangkok. And while the start of the office and this network of office was really clearly under the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, these offices have, or these regional centers have also started really operating under the Paris Agreement and very closely with our colleagues in Bonn on a range of topics under the Paris Agreement. So the original kind of narrow scope is really extended. And I'm trying to also present a little bit of the activities we're doing here in Bangkok that relate to nature-based solution, and also activities that directly engage the private sector. So first of all, as I mentioned, we're operating under the Paris Agreement, which is really a landmark agreement reached in 2015 at the COP in Paris, where countries agreed, first global agreement, agreed to a global response to the threat of climate change and to keep the temperature rise, the global temperature rise, to well below 2 degrees Celsius post-industrial levels, ideally aiming and pursuing 1.5 degrees. But also not only limiting the global temperature, but also helping country to enhance resilience and adaptation towards climate impacts. And lastly, the alignment of international finance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. As you are probably aware, countries were asked to submit national determined contributions, which is basically plans that countries develop to tackle climate change, to act to reduce emissions, but also to become more resilient which is basically the country and party side we're working on. But apart from this, we're really also more and more engaging with private sector. Yeah, just briefly on the interaction or relation between climate change and biodiversity. So while we're really mostly focusing on climate change, I think everyone over the last couple of years has also started to understand that these issues, that we're in a triple global crisis, and that these issues, as Sylvia has also mentioned in the introduction, are very strongly interlinked. So you can't really tackle climate change without biodiversity, and you will not solve biodiversity loss without really strong action on climate. As we can see here on this these jumping pictures. So a lot of species are impacted by climate change, also no changes in pollination patterns, which can have a very strong impact on food production, and a lot of other, without going into the details. But we need these functional and resilient ecosystems to actually adapt to the change in temperature, climate change that we can already not avoid anymore. So a strong link to be established. And just a very, very brief overview on the activities that I have I try to identify in our work plan that are mostly related to really climate, to private sector, and how we are working with private sector on climate action. So there's first of all Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, which is a UN-led partnership that really working on enabling collaboration between governments and non-party stakeholders, meaning cities, regions, also business and investors, academic institutions. So that has also become more and more important over the past years to really make sure private sector is part of the solution. We're organizing a variety of activities, for example, the regional climate weeks, but also at the Conference of Parties. The next COP is about to start in a couple of days. Activities and opportunities for private sector to engage. We have the Global Climate Action Summit, but we also have tracking tools that show climate and showcase climate action by private sector also in the yearbooks. And we have a set of tools called the Climate Action Pathways, with sectorial visions to how to reach the 1.5 resilient world in 2050. So I'd say that is maybe the main initiative that we are active. Apart from this, capacity building for SMEs, capacity building, I mean, for climate action, to understand the changing environments and impact on businesses, and then help these together with partners in the region, help to make SMEs, bring them in the position to be able to also implement climate action. And lastly, only very short here, Article 6 Paris Agreement, it's collaborative actions, often referred to as the article that covers carbon markets. And of course, carbon market is the main part of the Paris Agreement where private sector can be engaging, and the RCCs from next year on will be very active in providing capacity building to parties, but also to private sector on Paris Agreement, Article 6. Yeah, I think with this, as an introduction, it's probably not so short. I'd like to give back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Jens. And you already touched upon some substantive areas, which is in my next question. Next question is for Dominic, which is a bit of a general question, but of course he will tackle it from his point of view. What can the business sector in Thailand do to contribute to protect biodiversity? And I've also asked Dominic, if possible, to bring some example that he may know or he may have worked with in Thailand or somewhere else. Thank you, Dominic, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sylvia, for that question. So here in Thailand, as I explained in the introduction, we work on a number of different issues. So one of those is focus on the fisheries sector. So looking at how we can address both overfishing, but also destructive fishing practices, but also illegal fishing as well. And so we work with a number of different stakeholders, including the government, through to civil society and indeed the private sector. So a number of large conglomerates, some of those that were just in the previous section as well, have and continue to have very widespread influence and engagement in the fishing sector here in Thailand. And I think it's a really good way of illustrating some of broader business and industry challenges when we are discussing how can business be involved more in protecting biodiversity and ensuring that fragile ecosystems such as our marine areas and coastal areas can be maintained and protected for future generations. So if we look at Thailand's fishing industry and what companies can really be getting involved with, what we've been advocating for is for these so-called transparency mechanisms. So we see that the fishing industry really does need to reform in several ways to make itself more accountable and more transparent to scrutiny. So making sure that businesses, both for their own supply chains, but also for their consumers and their subsequent buyers, so retailers, supermarkets, restaurants, hotels, for example, they all have the ability to screen their supply chains for potential indicators of wrongdoing, both in terms of illegal fishing, but also destructive fishing practices, but also human rights abuses as well. For the purpose of this session, I'll just focus on the environmental impacts. So if we look at some of the destructive fishing practices that companies have to grapple with, here in Thailand, we have this fishing technique called bottom trawling, which can be an incredibly destructive practice as it does sweep up all marine life in its path. And it can also leave these very ugly scars on the seabed as these nets scrape along the bottom of the sea. And so this fishing technique is often used to provide the raw material for shrimp feeds and fish feeds and even poultry feeds as well. And it can be a very destructive practice with a very poor ratio in terms of the raw material that goes in compared to the actual product that you get at the end of the day. So some research that has been done in the past looking at this relationship between this raw material coming from these trawlers and being translated into shrimp, you might actually have a ratio of 6 tons of raw material going in for 1 ton of shrimp coming out. So if we're talking about how businesses can contribute to protecting biodiversity, it really is as simple as trying to phase out these very destructive fishing practices and these very inefficient, if that is the right word, ratios of raw material going in to produce farmed shrimp and farmed fish products for both domestic consumption, but also for export. A lot of Thailand's seafood industry is catered to the export market. And in the past, we have had issues with European Commission, for example, branding Thailand with a yellow card for not cooperating in the fight against illegal fishing. And we also have other stakeholders as well from the United States also pressuring Thailand to do more to protect marine life and biodiversity in its fisheries. So I think that Thailand has made progress, but there are still a lot of measures that can be taken to address gaps in protecting biodiversity here in Thailand. And just on a completely separate topic, sorry to jump around, but moving on to plastics as well, and our experience working on the issue of fishing nets, we have seen that in the past, there hasn't been this extended producer responsibility surrounding fishing nets and marine plastics in general. And so we feel that if businesses do want to get involved and how they really should get involved in terms of protecting biodiversity, it is by contributing to voluntary guidelines on extended producer responsibility as it relates to plastic waste and plastic pollution. so that if fishing nets do fall in the sea, that there are guidelines in place to mark those gears so we know where they've fallen into the sea, who is responsible, and whether there's any illegal action that took place to warrant that fishing net falling into the sea in the first place. So we see that extended producer responsibility as it relates to plastics can be factored in for fishing net waste as well. And companies can get involved in terms of the recycling of these nets as well. And we've seen a lot of uptake recently with some very progressive and forward-thinking companies here in Thailand taking the initiative and taking these nets, breaking them down, recycling them, and turning them into really nice, aesthetically pleasing products for consumers to buy. And those products can even be exported, and demonstrating that for plastic waste, it doesn't necessarily need to just be garbage or end up in landfill. It can actually be this incredibly important raw material, this resource that can be reborn, be given a new life, and return as a drinks coaster or be an internal computer inside a computer, for example. So there are a lot of different opportunities where businesses can get involved in plastics reduction and plastic waste reduction as well. And really, I think, so those are maybe some two good examples. I think broadly, we do need to see businesses taking the initiative where maybe there are lagging government policies or international regulations on issues such as plastic pollution, and pressuring almost their nation-state governments and regional governments as well to make sure that global treaties on plastic pollution and global treaties on importation of waste pollution and things like that can be robust as possible and as far-reaching as possible as well. So making sure that all types of plastic waste can be addressed by these treaties, and making sure that businesses really come to the table with constructive and far-reaching and progressive policies that they want to then take forward. So yeah, I might stop there. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dominic, for this inspiring ideas and experiences, and to, in a way, at least from my point of view, turn around a little bit what would be the role of the private sector in the building the new agreement on plastic. As we know, the world is in this process of moving toward a legally binding agreement on plastic. So we see the private sector, of course, very important in there, but the point that you bring is also the private sector to stand there where there are no regulations from the governments, and to point those out for their own benefits as well, and for the benefits, of course, of biodiversity and, in the end, of human health and the planet. So I would move now to Jens for a similar question to him, but of course, as he's coming from the climate change point of view, the question would be more on climate change. So again, what would be, from your point of view, what the business sector can do in Thailand on climate change, which can have a positive impact on nature conservation? And again, if you have any examples that you could share from Thailand or even other countries, that would be very welcome. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes. You are muted, yes.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think now it's okay. Do you see slides? Because
Yes,
okay.
We can see
yeah,
them.
I'm sorry that I'm jumping between slides and no slides, and I see other panelists don't have slides, but we have prepared something, so I think it can be quite useful to demonstrate a little bit. But before actually going to the first slide, I would like to pick up on something that Dominic just said, really on the role of private sector, also in a sense, kind of pressuring the governments to come up, maybe bringing it to climate action, more to climate action, come up with more ambitious targets. And I remember last year in 2021, before countries were traveling to Glasgow, and especially here in Thailand. We also had this UN Global Compact Network Forum, just, I don't know, a couple of days or weeks before the start of COP, with the private sector also signing up of increased targets, which I think allowed, I'm not sure about the actual causalities, but I think it's really important that private sector gives a signal to the governments that they are also on board for climate action, that they are ready to increase ambitions, because only these confirmations can allow governments to also set more ambitious targets. I guess it's a both way. It works in both ways. Of course, governments also need to set the policies for private sector to follow. But I think that is one really important role of the private sector, to keep the ambition high and kind of also demand from their governments, to keep the ambition high. Now coming to three areas where I believe private sector or the role of business is very important. First of all, speeding up emission reduction. So countries have submitted NDCs, as I've also mentioned in the beginning, focusing on a emission pathway for the next 10 years, but then also long-term low emission development strategies that actually set the targets towards the middle of the century. And it is important that private sector really understand and embrace these developments that is happening, and get on board with initiatives that also ask them to set these targets in line with what science is telling us. So science-based targets, ambitious targets to reach the 1.5 degrees, or the necessary emission reduction and carbon neutrality well by the middle of the century, to stay inside the 1.5 degrees. So here, number one, speeding up emission reduction. Number two, adjusting to the effects of climate change. So while we are focusing often on emission reduction, and the targets are often expressed in emission reduction by a certain year, equally important, and that's also emphasized regularly also by the UN Secretary General, adjusting adaptation is half of the story, and also half of the finance needs to go to adaptation. So while it's not sometimes immediately obvious for business, maybe it's not a very, very clear, obvious business case to engage in adaptation, it is equally important as mitigation, and also in terms of businesses. I think we heard in the last panel a little bit, the last question from our colleagues from the private sector. What kind of benefits do they see in the climate action that they have been taken? And a number of examples really also protecting their value chain, their raw material income, and also of course the communities that they are working with. So there's a number of very important also factors that business has to keep in mind, to not forget also investing and engaging in adaptation. And lastly, also something that's not often mentioned, but for us, for example, at the RCCs, we're here at the RCC in Bangkok engaged in a UN-led co-phase-out working group. I think that's just one example. Just transition to net zero, especially I'm talking about the energy transition, phasing out of fossil fuels, of course, will have a lot of impacts on society and communities, and business is also there to kind of moderate and lead and engage the communities to make sure that the transition that we are facing is really just, and also takes the maybe middle and low income communities into consideration. See if I can move. Yeah, I'm stuck. That's interesting. Otherwise, I'd have to. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned already also as one example of initiatives that we are engaged and that I'm really also want to promote for private sector to get engaged is the Race to Zero. It's an initiative. It's basically an umbrella initiative of many other initiatives that are out there to support business, private sector to develop their own pathways to net zero, basically measure their emissions, develop strategies how to bring down their emissions, and then also regularly report on the progress, and all this to be brought in line with the 1.5 degree targets. This initiative, as I said, as an umbrella, has really attracted more and more business to engage. Even here in Thailand, we have a number of network, Global Compact Network participants that also are part of these initiatives. You can see even during COVID, there was a huge incline of participation. It now covers 53% of global GDP and 23% of global emissions. Yeah, I can just recommend businesses because it doesn't only, it is also an initiative that will support businesses to develop such strategies. One of the initiatives under the umbrella of the global climate action is, for example, the science-based targets. I'm mentioning them here particularly because we've been working also last year pretty closely with the UN Global Compact on webinars and trainings developed here in the region, also supported by colleagues from the science-based targets, which will help companies to clearly define pathways to reduce emissions and in line with science-based targets, and then also support in a sense the implementation of such strategies with detailed feedback and technical expertise. Also briefly want to highlight the Global Climate Action Portal. This is where all activities are then being tracked. So tracking is very important also to see what is actually the contribution of private sector on climate action. So if you go to this portal, you'll also be able to see participants in the region in Thailand and what kind of activities they're implementing to be part of this initiative. Not to forget, Race to Resilient. It's basically a sibling initiative to the Race to Zero, now focusing more on building resilience, bringing non-party state actors on board to develop such plans. Maybe I don't go too much into detail, just also want to make sure that it's not forgotten. Why join? Yeah, recognize your targets and your credible action. It also shows a lot of knowledge, shares knowledge and tools and solution, and also communication material, how you can then promote your action to climate resilience. Oh, I'm not sure if I still have time to go through this one, but just very briefly, but stop me if we are running late. I think one of the important, and I've been preparing for this panel, is like where's really also the concrete overlaps of climate action and nature protection, biodiversity protection, and I think natural climate solution, or also nature-based solution. I think we've heard it quite often mentioned today already, also from other participants, is one of the category of activities that really also shows pretty clearly how climate action and nature conservation solution is very strongly linked. So basically, natural climate solution are projects or initiatives that harness ecosystem-based approaches, which direct benefit climate change, either mitigation, adaptation, or risk reduction, but also with a lot of other multiple social, economic, or environmental benefits. Broadly, maybe mention 4 categories that I can think of, which would be forest practices, wetland, agriculture, restorative action, or ocean-based practices. So there's a number of examples where private sector can get involved, either as part of your business practice, but maybe also as part of funding such activities, for example, through the use of carbon pricing or carbon market initiatives. This is a growing area of projects which has gained a lot of attention also since for the last past years, to have some quick, very important impact also on nature protection, while at the same time, implementing climate action. You can see, yeah.
Yes, I need to ask you to.
You need to stop me. Okay, but just I think that's the last one. So these NBS nature-based solutions are also on top of countries' NDC commitments, will help to close the gap between NDC commitments and maybe remaining emissions to really bring us down to the pathway to net zero by 2050, where we all need to be. So they play a very important role, and it's a very important area where business and private sector can get engaged. Thank you. Then I'm handing back over to you.
Thank you very much, Jens. And from my point of view, at least one of the things that you said that was more kind of different from what I've heard maybe in other panels is the fact that also businesses had to adapt to climate change, and the way they had to adapt to climate change is in a way that provides a just transition and is sustainable and also carbon neutral. So it's a very competitive, different, difficult way to adjust to this new world. But if they want to be keep the business going and be competitive, that's the way they have to do it. And also joining the race to resilience is important too. Not only the businesses benefit from the resilience actions, but the whole communities around them and society. We have very limited time, but I would like to ask, if possible, a very quick question to both of you. For Dominic, I would like to ask you, from your point of view, how do you see the maybe expectations of that for enhancing the role of the private sector in the protection of biodiversity that may come out of, or you would wish to come out of, the COP15, which is approaching in December, if any?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think my expectations for private sector engagement and especially as it relates to biodiversity would really boil down to transparency and accountability. So I think not just in the fishing sector, but across the board, even on plastics, even on wood, paper, all these other raw materials that a lot of conglomerates are involved in, natural resource extraction, we do need better access to data. And I think that companies need to have better accountability and transparency of their supply chains, so that consumers, retailers, suppliers can all understand exactly where the risks of biodiversity loss lie. So making sure that these companies are held to account for their actions, and that if suppliers who are engaging in destructive fishing practices, for example, or destructive logging practices, if those suppliers can be identified, then they can be screened and either filtered out of the supply chain or have wider enforcement action taken against them. So I think it really is going to boil down to where can we identify still these destructive practices in business engagement and business supply chains, and making sure that both businesses are trying to screen for these, themselves, but also that other stakeholders within society have the tools to actually screen these and monitor these activities ourselves. So looking at fisheries as one case study, there are a lot of emerging technologies which do facilitate both the business, private sector engagement, but also engagement from civil society as well. So using vessel tracking technologies, using supply chain tracking technologies, NGOs such as ourselves as EJF, we can gain access to vessel movements. We can see where fishing vessels are operating, whether they're operating in restricted, protected areas. And that gives us a huge amount of knowledge and power to be able to determine whether vessels have engaged in potential illegal fishing or potential destructive fishing as well. So I think those kinds of tools are coming to market, and businesses, private sector have access to those as well. And I think that they will play a great part and role in really enhancing their ability to protect biodiversity within their own supply chains.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And one last question for Jens. I know this will be difficult to keep short, but please keep it short. And it's about a recently report that your organization, the UNFCCC, has launched, and it's the NDC synthesis report that looks at the discrepancy between the contributions to the Paris Agreement of the present NDCs and what is actually needed to reach the goals or the target of the Paris Agreement. So if you could mention, of course, it's a huge report and with a lot of complexities, but if you can mention one highlight which may be relevant for our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I will indeed keep it very short. I think used up my time in the last question already and need to also head to another meeting. But the synthesis report that you mentioned is a report that has just been launched by UNFCCC a couple of days ago. I think it was the 26th of October. We had one synthesis report before last COP that showed us that emissions were still on the rise. So absolutely inefficient climate targets submitted by countries. As we know, this is a very important decade between now and 2030. A lot of the action and emission reduction has to happen to, at some point, keep us within the reach of 1.5 degrees goal. So last year we had a synthesis report, and this year we have an update. So it's easy to compare. There has definitely been some progress. So new submissions of NDCs, while much less than we would have liked to see, were submitted, now amount to emission increase 6 to 10.6%, down from 13.7 by the end of this decade, which is an improvement, but totally not in line with what we need to see, which is approximately a 45% reduction. Also, another report on long-term strategies. Much too few parties have submitted strategies, so I know a lot of countries still working on it. We, of course, like to see more in the coming years, and things are happening. Yeah, but what is important, what again tells us this report, is that the ambition before 2030 is too little, too low. Too little is happening, and there's an urgent need to again step up and see where ambition can be raised. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation or the panel, private sector does play a very important role together with governments to identify such opportunities and keep the ambition high. So I would again like to ask everyone to look at these initiatives that I've presented and introduced, and maybe for one or the other partner here in the network, there's some opportunity to get involved. That's it. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Jens. And we have heard indeed that Thailand will be presenting the new ambition on reduction of emissions this morning. So we hope that other countries will follow that example and bring the gap closer to be closed indeed. But with this, we need to close our session. I would like to thank very much both speakers, Dominique and Jens, for their presence and for their time and all the insights and suggestions that they shared with us today. And I hand over to the main moderator of the forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.